Welcome back. There are those who believe that term limits are the answer to bad government, period. After all, the president is term limited. Obama, Bush, Clinton, Reagan couldn't run for a third term, even if they or you wanted them to. Members of Congress, no term limits. Some of them have been there longer than a lot of our viewers have been alive. They'd argue that experience is an asset. Critics argue that government from D.C. to Tallahassee and now to your local school board could use a breath of fresh air every 8 to 12 years. And joining us for more are Sarasota School Board member Jane Goodwin, State Senator Greg Stubbe, Elizabeth DeGinnis, education reporter for the Herald Tribune. Thank you all for joining us tonight. And Greg, let me start with you, because when folks talk about term limits on the statewide level, in Tallahassee, you so often hear that, it takes state legislators a couple of years to even figure out where the bathroom is. And by the time they get used to where things are and how things are done, you basically have to move on.
I would agree to that to a point. It certainly takes you, if you don't have experience in state government or you haven't been up there as a staff person or something like that, it certainly takes you a little bit of time to get a grip on how the process works, how do you be effective in this process. But a lot of that is the way that, because we have term limits, very quickly, if you're in the House, you decide who your speaker is of your class. The Senate usually takes a little bit longer time to decide who their leader is. And so I think you can see both sides of the argument, but having term limits has given a lot of opportunity to people to run for different state level offices. I mean, the governor's term limited, the cabinet's term limited, all the members of the legislature are term limited. And what this constitutional amendment would do is just give the voters the choice. If the voters think that school board members should be term limited, then they have the ability to vote for the amendment. If not, they don't have to.
Jane, what's wrong with that?
Well, I think it's unnecessary. We already have, in the last 4 elections, 2010 through 2016, 41% turnover. And 65% of the races are competitive. So I think the voters are already doing that. And I think when it arises to the 30,000-foot level of the CRC every 20 years, it should be things that need to be impacted in a constitution is pretty serious. We have the ability here locally in Sarasota to enact that, as well as to enact it for any of our other constitutional officers.
All right, so let's explain this for a second. Originally, Senator, you sponsored legislation to put term limits into school board members. That did not make it through the legislative session, correct?
So it moved through the House, I think a couple of committees. In the Senate, we went through one committee, and actually it got amended by a Democrat to add it instead of 8 years to 12, and it passed with bipartisan support out of its first committee, and then got to the second committee and wasn't heard.
So therefore, it is now being talked about at the Constitutional Revision Commission, where it may or may not get on the ballot for everyone to vote on in November. Elizabeth, you covered the school board here in Sarasota. There are members who are fairly new, bringing a different perspective, but there are also members who have been there for quite some time.
Yeah, I was going to say, so if you look at it, if this does end up getting on the ballot and it passes, I mean, it would definitely affect us here. It's not retroactive, but I think that we have 3 school board members. Jane is up for re-election, but she's been in already for 2 terms, and Caroline served on and off. I want to say 20 years now. Shirley's been on since 2006, so it would be a.
But what's been the dynamic between the newer members of the school board and the older members of the school board? Not in terms of age, I mean in terms of length of service.
Yeah, I feel like that's a loaded question. I mean, there has been a tense dynamic. I think it's unfair to attribute that just to who's been on the board longer. I think that's also because of some differences in the way that people think on the board in that divide. But yes, there has been some tension, I think, between those who are newer members and those who are older
members. Has that been healthy?
I mean, that's not for me to say, but I think it has led to disagreements, and if you think that it has allowed, I think, other viewpoints to be represented. Okay,
we are just getting warmed up in this conversation. We'll have much more on possible term limits for school board members in a moment, right after we check the first alert weather. Stay with us. Welcome back. We're talking about whether term limits should be placed on school board members, and joining us for more is Sarasota School Board member Jane Goodwin, State Senator Greg Stubbe, and education reporter for the Herald Tribune, Elizabeth DeGinnis. And Senator, let me start with you. The president of the School Board Association was quoted as saying, "You couldn't have a vision past 4 years. If they want to know how their proposals affect school board members, we're ready to talk to them." Basically, she's saying that the benefit for not having these in effect is that school board members could look over the long period of time and take the long view of education in their own communities.
Well, you would say the same thing about the legislature then. So I guess then we should be looking at things over a 4 to 8 year period of time. But things happen so fast. I mean, if you look at the time that I was in the state legislature the last 8 years and the changes, and Jane can allude to this, the changes in education policy that we've had at the state level for the last 8 years, it changes on a yearly, every couple of year basis. So I don't really know, they are constantly reacting to the things that we are doing at the state level because we have such an impact on state education policy, and they have to abide by the things that the legislature passes.
Well, Jane, let me ask you this. Since state education policy has changed that much over the last couple of years, does that make it easier or more difficult for local school members to do what you want to do in terms of public education here in your local community?
It makes it more difficult. This year we received, in our base student allocation, 47 cents, which was compressed with our taxing authority here in this county, and we received like minus $24 per student to keep the lights on and the teachers in the classrooms. That's reality. A lot of our budget this year went to safety and security, as it should. But basically the momentum, the continuity, the educational knowledge that is required of this job takes the long look and the long haul. The senator modified his law or statute or possible law from 8 to 12 years, and I like that much better. I think that's far more palatable. But as I say, the voters make a decision every 4 years, and they are making that decision with about 41% turning over every 2 years. So I think that makes a big emphasis on home rule or local authority having the ability to make that decision, and that's why I think that it's important to keep it local. We have one district, one county, Duval County, which we call the ping-ponging district, and all of the constitutional officers are term limited to 8 years. They looked at going to 12 this year and couldn't get it to pass their council, but the appraiser runs for the tax collector when he's termed out, and then he runs for council, and then he runs for something else. So it's not working anywhere but Duval.
Elizabeth, you often hear this debate about term limits, whether we're talking about Congress or we're talking about the State House and so forth, but at least here locally you have not, or have you heard people who go to those school board members talk about wanting to have term limits for those who are there now?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't really heard this just in talking to people. I think Jane has a point. I mean, the voters do get to decide ultimately who they want in office, and I think that there is a lot of the nature of the job is it's very granular, and there's a lot of detail-oriented things you need to know to be on the school board.
Is there a difference between, because Jane, you said that there is a substantial turnover on the school board, unlike Congress. They say once you are in, you could spend the rest of your career there. Aren't we seeing on the local level, as Jane said, that the school boards are flipping over by themselves?
Well, I absolutely would support and do support a congressional term limits. I think that's something that needs to happen at the federal level, and just like I supported at the state level. But I mean, there's been some turnover in Sarasota County, but as was mentioned, there's 3 members, including Jane, that have been there for more than 2 terms. So you also have some people that have been there for a while too. So like Jane said, you have a very diverse, different group of folks at the Sarasota school district. But the bottom line is, in my opinion, is the voters are going to get to decide. It's going to be on the ballot. If they want term limits for school board members, then they can vote for it. If they don't, then they don't have to vote for it. And let the voters decide whether they think it's appropriate.
And again, let's talk about the process for a second. The Constitutional Revision Commission is talking about whether or not to put this on the November ballot right now. Elizabeth, it has to pass by a certain percentage for it to go into a law, and it's also involved with a couple of other things that the commission is talking about in terms of public education.
You're right. Yeah, there are other things up for conversation too. I think one of them has to do with charter schools, and the other one has to do with civic literacy. So I think those we'll kind of have to see how those all play out as things progress.
Jane, are you concerned about the whole package
Yes.
of ideas? Why?
Oh yes, because we've got 2 that polled well, which is civic literacy and term limits, because the term limit itself, without understanding it, sounds good to a lot of people. But the third one is the ability to authorize charter schools. Right now, only school districts have the ability to authorize charter schools. So any charter schools coming into Sarasota County, we are the authority that actually would acknowledge and approve that application. They're looking at, on the state level, having an authorizer. So what I think would happen is, and it's very sketchy, so the proposal itself doesn't give a lot of detail, but that would perhaps allow others to start making decisions for Sarasota County outside of Sarasota County and looking at things like growth and the need and potential with what is here outside of the county. So it really motivates those folks who are for-profit charters. You know, most of our charters here in this district are homegrown and they're organic, and they are pretty much started by Sarasota County residents. So I have great fear for that.
You know, Greg, you so often hear politicians in Washington talking about, or politicians in general, talking about, you know, local voters making local decisions. Wouldn't this be another attempt of, you know, putting the power in Tallahassee in terms of making some of these decisions, rather than, let's say, the people of Sarasota about whether or not they want more charter schools or not?
Well, I don't think as it relates to term limits. I mean, I think you're allowing every voter in the state of Florida to decide whether they feel it's appropriate to have term limits at their local school board level. And if you look at most of the polling and where people are on term limits, they're pretty widely supported. So I think as it relates to that, let the people decide what they think is most appropriate. I tried to pass a bill in the legislature. It didn't pass this year, and the CRC still has to go through some of its process. I think they have another meeting or so that they have to do to get through their process. But if it goes on the ballot, let the voters decide what they think is appropriate for the state.
Elizabeth, is this another example of the changing nature of even school board races? You know, it used to be that a candidate for the school board would spend a couple of hundred or a couple of $1,000 on a school board race. Now we are seeing amounts, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 for a school board race. That it's not what it used to be.
Yeah, I think things have really kind of ratcheted up even in local elections, but I think that, you know, this is just another chance to see how voters feel about whether they want term limits for school board members. It's obviously up for debate if that ends up being in other local positions too, so it'll be interesting.
So Jane, it sounds to me that you would be fine if there was a term limit of, let's say, 12 years,
yes.
But I would imagine you're not going to be in favor of the proposal that's
Well, grouping the civic literacy, the charter school amendment for the authorizer, along with the term limits, all into one yes, is of concern to me. But I am not for this. No, I would not be in favor of this.
Who do you think is pushing this proposal as it is?
The reformers, the choice people who are all about more charter schools and more vouchers. We have now the third largest amount of charter schools in the country. We have 654 charters right behind Texas and California, and a lot of them are doing very well, and we believe they're part of our public education system. But I think this might cause a wedge between public schools and charter schools. And then we have voucher programs as well, which we have the largest amount of voucher programs in the country.
Okay, we have to take a quick break, and we'll be back for final thoughts in a moment, so stay with us. And our guests join us right now for final thoughts. So Elizabeth, you are a close observer of our school board, which is really a pretty dynamic place these days. When you watch what goes on there, for the members of the school board who have been there for years now, what do you, do they often cite what happened 5, 10 years ago in terms of debating what is before the school board now?
Definitely. I mean, I think institutional knowledge is something that's discussed quite often. I mean, I see it most commonly both in, I would say, things like union negotiations. That was an extended process this year, and a lot of the discussion went back to what have we done in past years. And then also, I would say, things like budget cuts. I hear a lot of discussions about when we cut this year, how we did it, you know, in past years. So I think it is something that comes into play quite often. It would be hard for me to say what term limits would look like if we did end up having those, but I think it's something that's discussed.
So, Greg, how do you handle things like that if we're talking about a labor negotiation and the history thereof, or the other parts of the budget, when you might have new school board members who don't have that institutional knowledge?
You get elected and you get educated on the issues, just like any person at any level of government. When you run for an office, you need to be educated, and if you get elected, you need to know and be knowledgeable of the issues. Look, the U.S. president's term limited. Every member of the Florida legislature, both the House and the Senate, is term limited to 8 years. The entire cabinet and our governor's term limited. The Sarasota County Commission's term limited. And all this does is allow the voters to decide whether they think it's appropriate for school board members.
Jane, you get the final word.
Well, I just would say, please stay tuned to the Florida channel for the Constitutional Revision Commission meetings to see government working on these issues. We had 24 proposals and now we have 12. Some of them are grouped, others are single. But pay attention, because these things are important that only come up once every 20 years. I am against this amendment because it is confusing and because it consists of 3 things that are not related. The most unpalatable is the charter school authorizer, but stay tuned and please pay attention, and thank you for having me on tonight.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there. FYI, you can watch past discussions on demand. They're available on Apple TV, Amazon Fire, and Roku. We want to thank all our guests for being here tonight. Jane Goodwin of the Sarasota School Board, State Senator Greg Stubbe, and Elizabeth DeGenis with the Herald Tribune. When we return, we'll have a final look at your first alert weather, plus President Trump issuing a warning to the Syrian president, the suspected chemical weapons attack that's turning all eyes towards the Middle East. Stay with us.